Behind the polished exteriors of 1950s locomotives lurked disasters the railroads hoped no one would ever see. This was the decade engineers tried to outsmart steam, outmuscle diesel, and redesign railroading overnight. On paper, these machines were revolutionary, faster, cleaner, more powerful, and supposedly cheaper. In reality, some of them hemorrhaged money, terrified maintenance crews, and collapsed entire operating plans. A few were so problematic they were pulled from service before the public even understood what they were looking at. Railroads called them experiments. Executives called them necessary risks. Crews called them time bombs on rails. No one likes to talk about the locomotives that looked like the future, promised dominance, and instead became expensive lessons no railroad wanted to repeat. These are 10 locomotives from the 1950s that were brilliant and failed miserably. The Erie-built looked like diesel royalty the moment it rolled off the drawing board. Sleek, aggressive, and dripping confidence. Railroads were promised a revolutionary passenger locomotive, one that could dethrone EMD's monopoly and redefine American railroading. But behind that polished exterior lurked a machine that could bite back. Under the hood was Fairbanks Morse's infamous opposed piston marine engine, a design borrowed from submarines. On paper, it offered unmatched efficiency and power. In practice, it required levels of maintenance most railroads couldn't handle. One misaligned bearing, one improperly adjusted injector, and the locomotive could be out of commission for days. Shops were not equipped for this kind of precision engineering, and crews often felt like they were defusing a ticking time bomb instead of running a train. Engines would seize mid-journey, electrical systems would short under the stress, and parts were scarce, leading to long downtimes. Railroad managers quickly realized the Erie-built's brilliance was only for those willing to pay with blood, sweat, and endless overtime. What was marketed as the future of passenger service became a cautionary tale almost overnight. Some Erie-builts were literally too heavy for certain tracks, sparking dangerous derailments and forcing routes to be limited. Critics whispered that Fairbanks Morse had rushed these locomotives to compete with EMD, prioritizing marketing hype over reliability. The company's bold promise of domination backfired, leaving railroads stuck with beautiful but temperamental machines that cost fortunes to run and still couldn't outperform the dependable competition. When elegance failed to save Fairbanks Morse, the industry doubled down on style. Locomotives would become sleeker, flashier, and more publicly adored, but underneath, the lessons of the Erie-built were never forgotten. Sometimes, brilliance is just a mask for disaster. If locomotives were celebrities, the PA-1 would have been Hollywood royalty. Its sleek, aerodynamic body turned heads at every station, and its thunderous exhaust sounded like applause for an era trying to outshine steam. Rail fans photographed it obsessively. Passengers felt a thrill just watching it roll past. It was the locomotive equivalent of a tuxedo on wheels. Impressive, confident, untouchable. But behind the glamour lurked Alco's 244 engine, a heart as volatile as it was powerful. Early models were plagued by overheating, turbo failures, and cracked crankshafts. Reliability was a guessing game. Some locomotives needed constant attention just to stay on schedule, transforming what should have been a symbol of progress into a maintenance nightmare. Crews called it the Diva in whispers, because it demanded perfect conditions to perform and punished even minor mistakes. The irony was brutal. Alco had built something everyone wanted to admire, but no one wanted to operate. Railroads learned that the PA-1's beauty couldn't hide its flaws, and every hour of downtime was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. And yet, Alco refused to abandon the 244 engine, gambling on fixes that often came too late to save contracts or credibility. The PA-1 became a symbol of ambition pushed too far, a glamorous failure that left railroads paying for the privilege of owning it. As Alco's engineers wrestled with this mechanical celebrity, Baldwin was already planning its next over-the-top experiment, one that would make PA-1's drama look tame by comparison. When Baldwin looked at the dawn of dieselization, it aimed for domination. Enter the Centipede, a locomotive so massive it seemed to consume the tracks underneath it. The DR-12-8 1500/2 was unapologetically over-engineered, a rolling paradox of ambition and impracticality. Two 1500 horsepower engines, 12 axles, and a mechanical complexity that could intimidate even the most seasoned railroad engineers. Its design blueprint read more like a fighter jet's maintenance manual than a locomotive schedule sheet. On paper, the Centipede was a freight-hauling monster. On a perfectly straight, perfectly maintained track, it could pull tons with apparent ease. But the real world of curves, switches, and inconsistent maintenance told a different story. Engines would overheat, axles would misalign, and electrical failures became almost ritualistic. Entire crews spent hours trying to coax these beasts into motion, only to watch them stall mid-route. Maintenance costs soared, and railroads realized, painfully, that sheer size and mechanical ambition could not compensate for reliability. And it got worse. The Centipede's enormous weight caused damage to track infrastructure, forcing some lines to reinforce rails or restrict operations, creating headaches far beyond the engine itself. Some engineers joked darkly that the locomotives seemed designed to test a railroad's patience more than its schedule. Baldwin had built a machine that was impressive in theory, but a disaster in practice. One whose failures became almost legendary among maintenance crews. Yet Baldwin, notoriously stubborn, refused to retreat from bold designs. The Centipede was a lesson in hubris and excess, but the company's appetite for extreme innovation was only growing. If one locomotive failed spectacularly, Baldwin would simply double down, this time with a new design, sharper, meaner, and even more ambitious. The Centipede's drama cast a long shadow, but it wouldn't be long before Baldwin's next creation, its infamous sharknose, took center stage, proving that style and spectacle could be just as risky as brute force. Baldwin's sharknose was designed to intimidate. With its pointed, aggressive snout and futuristic lines, it looked like a locomotive ready to bite, as if sheer style could win contracts that reliability couldn't. On the showroom floor and in glossy advertisements, the sharknose promised power, speed, and modernity, but the reality behind that striking facade was far less glamorous. Underneath the bold design lurked Baldwin's old demons: excessive weight, overly complex engineering, and diesel engines that required meticulous care just to function. Minor misalignments or skipped maintenance could trigger catastrophic failures, yet Baldwin marketed them as precision machines for forward-thinking railroads. Crews quickly learned that running well was conditional. Perfectly tuned engines were rare, schedules were tight, and mechanical tantrums were frequent. The sharknose was visually stunning, but it carried the heavy price of arrogance. Maintenance crews quietly cursed its intricate systems, and railroads realized that while competitors like EMD and Alco offered reliable performance, Baldwin was selling an image more than a practical locomotive. Even admirers couldn't ignore the growing pile of service reports: broken traction motors, overheating components, and engines that refused to cooperate under real-world conditions. Some historians have called the sharknose a victim of style over substance, but that might be giving Baldwin too much credit. In truth, it was a calculated gamble, an attempt to convince the market that fearsome looks could overshadow decades of operational missteps. And it largely worked, in drawing attention, if not in securing lasting contracts. Meanwhile, Alco was dealing with the consequences of its own compromises. The PA1's fame had faded under the weight of mechanical failures, proving that beauty and power were no substitute for dependability. The industry was learning a harsh truth: innovation could impress, but only reliability could survive. Alco set out to produce the FA series as the reliable backbone of diesel railroading, a locomotive that could replace aging steam engines and earn the trust of every railroad from coast to coast. On paper, it was a workhorse, sleek, strong, and designed for both freight and passenger service. But early units revealed a darker reality. These locomotives were essentially rolling laboratories for Alco's 244 engine, an engine infamous for volatility and temperamental behavior. Crankshafts snapped under routine loads, turbochargers overheated with alarming frequency, and electrical components shorted without warning. Trains would arrive late, sometimes stranded entirely, and maintenance crews were left scrambling to patch together temporary fixes. Railroads tolerated these FA units only because competition was limited. Options like EMD were expensive, and the diesel market was still consolidating. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Alco's reputation, carefully built over decades, eroded faster than any horsepower rating could rise. Where FA locomotives should have inspired confidence, they inspired dread. Engineers whispered about locomotive lotteries, where the outcome of each run depended as much on luck as skill. Some railroads outright refused to order replacements, and contracts slipped to more dependable rivals. Yet, Alco's engineers and indeed much of the industry remained fascinated by complexity. The FA proved that ambition could blind manufacturers to practicality. If a locomotive promised power and innovation, failures were often dismissed as growing pains. This obsession with pushing boundaries at all costs would continue elsewhere, most notably in Fairbanks Morse's next generation of engines. The FA's saga was a stark warning. Brilliance meant nothing if it couldn't survive the daily grind. And while Alco wrestled with its 244 demons, the railroad world was already bracing for the next wave of bold, temperamental machines, the FM H2466 Trainmaster. On paper, the FM H2466 Trainmaster was a legend in the making, a locomotive designed to crush freight records and make steam engines look like antiques. With massive horsepower and tractive effort that could rival multiple locomotives combined, it promised to redefine what diesel could do. Railroads salivated at the idea of replacing entire steam with a single machine that seemed unstoppable. But in reality, the Trainmaster was a beast nobody wanted to tame. It carried Fairbanks Morse's notorious opposed piston engine, the same design that had already haunted the Erie-built, magnified to a scale that maintenance crews could barely comprehend. One minor oversight could trigger catastrophic failures. Overheating, oil leaks, electrical gremlins, and crankshaft stress became daily threats. Some units spent more time in shops than on the rails, turning raw power into operational paralysis. Costs spiraled as railroads tried to adapt. Special tooling, trained mechanics, and constant inspections became mandatory just to keep a single trainmaster running. Despite its theoretical dominance, the locomotive proved that horsepower was meaningless if a machine couldn't survive the daily grind. Engineers praised its brilliance, but administrators cursed its expense, and crews muttered about its temperamental nature. The Trainmaster's spectacular ambition served as a warning across the industry. Pushing boundaries without considering practical reliability could create rolling financial nightmares. And just as railroads began to hesitate, weary from battling complexity, General Electric quietly entered the fray, poised to offer a different kind of innovation, one that promised modern power with fewer headaches. When General Electric rolled out the U-25B prototypes, it was challenging the established order. For decades, EMD had dominated the diesel market, and other manufacturers like Alco, Baldwin, and FM had faltered under the weight of overambition. GE stepped in with bold claims. Innovative electronics, unprecedented horsepower, and a vision that promised to modernize railroading from the ground up. But ambition came with a price. These early units were riddled with teething problems. Electrical systems that promised efficiency instead sparked intermittent failures. Traction motors overheated under heavy loads, and control electronics occasionally behaved unpredictably. Maintenance crews, still recovering from the headaches of complex Fairbanks Morse and Baldwin designs, found themselves navigating unfamiliar systems that required new skills, new training, and a healthy dose of patience. Railroads approached cautiously, some ordering only a few units to test the waters. The U-25B was revolutionary, but it was also a reminder that innovation rarely arrives flawless. Every breakthrough carried scars, broken components, delayed schedules, and a mounting fear of unproven technology. GE's entry disrupted the market and signaled a new era. But the shadow of diesel failures past loomed large. Every engineer, every railroad manager remembered the costly lessons of the Erie-built, the Trainmaster, and the Sharknose. Before GE could claim dominance, diesel history was already haunted. The ghosts of over-engineered machines, ambitious but unreliable designs, and spectacular failures lingered. The U-25B had to prove not just that it could innovate, but that it could survive a railroading world scarred by machines that promised brilliance but delivered chaos. And as GE cautiously stepped into the limelight, history still had one more set of ghosts waiting to remind the industry how quickly boldness can become a disaster: the experimental EMC DL series. The EMC DL series was born in diesel's chaotic adolescence, an era when manufacturers were experimenting with every imaginable design, hoping to find the formula that would replace steam forever. These locomotives were long, awkward, and boxy, the kind of machines that made engineers wonder if form had been sacrificed entirely to untested ambition. Inside, the DL series was a tangle of experimental layouts. Access for maintenance was awkward, components were scattered, and performance was inconsistent from unit to unit. Engines that worked flawlessly one day could fail spectacularly the next. Railroads quickly realized that these locomotives were not unreliable because of poor craftsmanship, but because the industry itself hadn't yet figured out what worked. Timing, as much as design, had doomed the DL series from the start. Despite their shortcomings, some railroads still clung to the idea that specialization could beat standardization. The DL series promised unique solutions for specific routes or loads, and a few bold managers were willing to gamble on these prototypes. In reality, that gamble often backfired. Maintenance headaches, downtime, and unpredictable performance meant that the DL series quietly vanished as more practical, standardized designs from EMD, Alco, and even GE took over. The DL series may have been a fleeting failure, but it carried a harsh lesson. Innovation without operational reliability is a gamble railroads rarely win. And yet, ambition never sleeps. While the DL series faded, the Pennsylvania Railroad was already commissioning its own audacious experiment. The BP-20 passenger sharks, proving that even the giants of railroading could be seduced by style, complexity, and the promise of cutting-edge performance. The Pennsylvania Railroad wanted a statement. The BP-20 passenger sharks were their vision brought to life. Sleek, powerful, and visually dominant, designed to impress passengers and competitors alike. At first glance, they looked unstoppable, a perfect marriage of speed and swagger. But beneath the dramatic exterior lurked familiar problems. These were, in essence, Baldwin locomotives in disguise. They inherited the same DNA that had plagued the company's freight units for years. Excessive weight, complex engines, and systems that required near constant attention. Maintenance crews quickly realized that running a BP-20 was a test of patience and endurance. One misstep could mean hours, even days of downtime, and parts were often scarce or difficult to replace. The Pennsylvania Railroad's ambitious passenger dream rapidly collided with reality. Speed and style were undeniable, but practical performance lagged. The locomotives became more ceremonial than functional, admired for their looks but quietly cursed for their quirks. Railroads that depended on reliability couldn't justify keeping such temperamental machines on critical routes. Eventually, the Pennsylvania Railroad walked away, leaving behind a fleet of some of the most visually striking but operationally sidelined passenger locomotives in history. And as the dust settled on the BP-20s, Baldwin prepared its final act, a last attempt to prove that it could still compete in the diesel market. The stage was set for the RS-12, Baldwin's swan song in a decade littered with brilliant yet disastrous machines. The RS-12 was Baldwin's desperate bid for redemption, a last stand after years of ambitious failures, from the Centipede to the Sharknose and the BP-20 passenger sharks. Designed as a simpler, more conventional road switcher, it was meant to prove that Baldwin could build a reliable, practical locomotive without the excessive weight, complexity, or temperamental engines that had haunted its reputation. On paper, it worked. The RS-12 was competent, straightforward, and easy enough for crews to maintain. It ran, it switched, and it hauled freight like a standard diesel of the era. But the problem was trust. By the time Baldwin delivered the RS-12, railroads had already committed to EMD and Alco locomotives, which offered proven performance, easier maintenance, and a network of parts and service that Baldwin could no longer compete with. The RS-12, no matter how capable, was too little, too late. Sometimes in railroading, failure is measured in timing, reputation, and the ability to survive a market that remembers your mistakes. Baldwin had brilliance before, but its earlier miscalculations had left a scar the RS-12 could never erase. What should have been a redemption story instead became the final chapter in a saga of overambition, spectacular failures, and lessons railroads would never forget. The RS-12 closed Baldwin's curtain in the 1950s, a decade when diesel locomotives promised revolution but often delivered chaos. It was proof that in the race for innovation, being first isn't always the same as being right, and sometimes the most brilliant machines are remembered not for what they achieved, but for how spectacularly they fell short. The 1950s promised a diesel revolution, and the railroads bought the dream sleek, powerful, and full of ambition. But ambition has a dark side. For every locomotive that wowed the eye and shook the rails, there was another that bled budgets, tested patience, and humiliated crews. These machines were cautionary tales of hubris, timing, and the seductive danger of brilliance unchecked by practicality. History remembers the giants of railroading, the EMDs, the dependable workhorses, but the ghosts of Baldwin, Fairbanks, Morse, and Alco linger. They haunt the stories of spectacular promises that never delivered, of trust squandered, and of engineering dreams that turned into nightmares. Sometimes the most brilliant inventions aren't remembered for what they did. They're remembered for how spectacularly they fell apart. And in the shadow of these failures, the lesson is clear. In railroading, as in life, vision without execution can be deadly, and history is brutally unforgiving.